My name is Faye Sterling. I'm 36 years old, and for the last decade of my life, I worked inside the same glass building in downtown Seattle. If you had asked my coworkers what they thought about me during those years, most of them would probably have said something polite but vague. Faye? Oh, she's reliable, very organized, quiet but good at what she does. I was the person people trusted to remember the things everyone else forgot. Deadlines, processes, the small, invisible mechanics that keep a company moving when nobody's paying attention. But I wasn't the loud one in meetings. I wasn't the one pitching bold ideas on whiteboards or interrupting conversations to be heard. And in corporate spaces, silence has a strange way of being interpreted. Sometimes people assume it means you have nothing to say. Sometimes they assume you're comfortable staying exactly where you are. And sometimes they assume you won't notice when things start happening around you. For 10 years, I watched the rhythms of that company like someone listening to a complicated piece of music. You begin to hear patterns after a while. Who gets credit? Who gets overlooked? Which conversations happen in conference rooms? And which ones happen in quiet side messages after the meeting ends? The story I'm about to tell isn't dramatic in the way people usually expect. There were no shouting matches in boardrooms, no slammed doors, no revenge fantasies. What happened was quieter than that. It began on a morning that should have felt like a celebration. The calendar invitation arrived the same morning HR sent a congratulations email for my decade with the company. One message thanked me for 10 years of dedication. The other scheduled a meeting titled Organizational Alignment Discussion, hosted by my manager. 30 minutes. Mandatory. If you've spent enough time in corporate life, you learn to read the language between the words. That meeting was my termination meeting, and it had been scheduled on the exact day of my 10-year anniversary. But the real story isn't about that moment. It's about everything that came before it, and the quiet decisions that came after. Because sometimes the people who appear the calmest in the room are the ones who have been paying attention the longest, and when they finally decide to move, they don't do it loudly. They do it carefully. They do it quietly. And by the time anyone else understands what's happening, it's already too late to change it. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to start somewhere simpler, with the version of me that everyone thought they understood. But let me ask you something first. Have you ever been in a place where people thought they knew exactly who you were, while completely missing the most important parts? For most of my 10 years at that company, I occupied a very specific place in people's minds. Not an important one, but a useful one. If you had mapped the social hierarchy of our office, you would have seen clear roles. The charismatic product lead spoke confidently in meetings. The fast-moving sales team always seemed to be chasing the next quarter's numbers. The directors who walked quickly through the hallways with phones pressed to their ears. And then there were people like me, the operational backbone, the ones who knew how the machinery actually worked. I joined the company when I was 26, just 2 months after moving to Seattle. At the time, the company was still growing, big enough to feel ambitious, but small enough that systems weren't fully built yet. That was where I naturally settled. Processes, documentation, quiet structure. While other people chased visibility, I spent my early years doing something far less glamorous, making sure things didn't break. I built internal tracking sheets when none existed, documented procedures nobody had written down, fix small inefficiencies that saved teams hours each week. None of it was dramatic work, but it made life easier for everyone around me. And in the beginning, people noticed. Managers would stop by my desk to ask how I had figured something out. Someone from another department would message me because they'd heard I knew how the system worked. Occasionally, during team meetings, my name would come up when a complicated workflow needed explaining. At first, I thought that meant I was building a reputation. Looking back now, I realized something else was happening. People were learning what role I fit into. Not the strategist, not the leader, not the person who would one day run things, the reliable one. The person who could quietly solve problems behind the scenes. And reliability has a strange side effect. The better you become at it, the more invisible your work starts to feel. Because when something runs smoothly, nobody stops to ask why. They simply assume it always worked that way. By my 4th year at the company, new employees often assumed I had always been there. I knew the internal tools better than some of the engineers who had built them. I remembered decisions that had been made years earlier in meetings most people had forgotten. That knowledge made me valuable, but it also made me predictable. If someone needed a quick answer, they came to me. If a process broke, they expected I'd quietly fix it. If something needed documenting, it somehow landed on my desk. And over time, the language people used about me became very consistent. Faye's great with details. She's really dependable. Honestly, she just keeps everything running. All of those things were meant as compliments, but none of them described leadership. None of them suggested vision or influence or authority, just reliability. And reliability is comfortable for other people. Reliable employees don't cause disruption. They don't ask difficult questions. They don't threaten the existing order. They show up. They solve problems. They go home. So that's who I became in their eyes. The calm one at the edge of the meeting table, the quiet voice that occasionally clarified a process, the person who wrote the documentation that everyone else relied on. Someone useful, but not someone anyone worried about. If you had asked my manager back then to describe me, I imagine he would have said something like this. Faye, she's solid, very steady. Not really a big personality, but she's great to have on the team. And I believe that was enough. For a long time, I didn't question it, until the first moment arrived when something small happened. Something so subtle that nobody else in the room seemed to notice. But I did. And once you notice a pattern for the first time, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. The first moment wasn't dramatic. In fact, if you had been sitting in the conference room that afternoon, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual at all. It was a regular Tuesday strategy meeting, the kind that happened every other week. Department leads, a few analysts, and our manager gathered around the long glass table near the windows. Whiteboard markers are scattered across the surface. Laptops open. Coffee cups are slowly cooling. The topic that day was a recurring operational issue that had been causing delays between our logistics team and the engineering department. Orders were getting stuck in a system handoff, and nobody seemed entirely sure where the breakdown was happening. People had been discussing it for weeks. The conversation followed a familiar rhythm. Someone would suggest a theory. Another person would counter it. Then the topic would drift somewhere else before anything was actually resolved. About 20 minutes into the meeting, I noticed something, a pattern in the workflow logs. I had spent the previous week quietly reviewing the handoff timestamps between systems. What I saw was surprisingly simple. A small automated trigger that had been built years earlier was firing at the wrong stage of the process. It wasn't a complicated fix. It just hadn't been noticed. When there was a brief pause in the conversation, I spoke up. My voice wasn't loud. It never was. I think the trigger is activating before the confirmation flag finishes updating, I said. If we move that step 2 positions later in the sequence, the handoff delay should disappear. The room went quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, just the kind of pause people take when they're processing something. A couple of people nodded slightly. My manager, Daniel, leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the engineering lead across the table. Then he said something that, at the time, seemed completely harmless. That's actually a really good point, he said. And then he turned to the engineer and added, Jason, do you think we could adjust the trigger timing to fix the handoff issue? Jason looked thoughtful for a moment, then shrugged slightly. Yeah, he said. That would probably work. The conversation immediately moved forward. People started discussing implementation timelines. Someone wrote a quick action item on the whiteboard. Daniel began outlining how we'd communicate the change to other teams. Within 5 minutes, the group had essentially adopted the solution. My solution. But something subtle had shifted during that exchange. No one had said my name again. The idea had entered the room through me and then quietly detached itself. Jason was now explaining how the fix would work. Daniel was discussing the rollout plan. Others were nodding along as if the solution had simply appeared somewhere in the middle of the conversation. It wasn't intentional, at least not consciously. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed what I said. But the credit drifted, like a piece of paper sliding slowly across a table until someone else's hand happened to be closer. When the meeting ended, people packed their laptops and stood up, chatting casually as they headed toward the hallway. Jason walked past me and said, "Good catch on that trigger thing." Daniel gave me a quick nod on his way out. "Nice thinking, Faye." Both comments were friendly. Both were sincere. And yet something about the moment stayed with me the rest of the day, because the solution we implemented that week solved a problem that had been slowing down operations for months. Leadership praised the team during the next department update. Jason was mentioned for helping implement the technical fix. Daniel was thanked for coordinating the response. My name didn't come up. Again, it wasn't dramatic. No one was trying to erase me. But that was the first time I realized something important about how recognition moves inside organizations. Ideas don't always belong to the person who sees them first. Sometimes they belong to the person the room already expects to hear them from. And once I noticed that small shift, I began noticing other ones too. After that meeting, nothing changed, at least not on the surface. The workflow fix worked exactly the way I expected it to. The delays between departments disappeared within a few days, and the logistics team quietly celebrated having one less recurring issue in their weekly reports. Life inside the office continued the same way it always had. Meetings, deadlines, projects moving forward, and for a while I told myself the moment in that conference room had simply been a normal part of workplace dynamics. Not every idea needs a spotlight. Not every contribution needs to be acknowledged. That was the story I told myself. Because once you start examining every interaction too closely, work can become exhausting very quickly. So I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But something subtle had shifted in my awareness. It's difficult to explain, but once you notice a pattern, your mind begins quietly scanning for it again, and slowly I started to see the same dynamic repeating itself in different forms. Not constantly, not aggressively, just often enough to feel familiar. Sometimes it was in meetings. I would suggest a change to a process, and the conversation would pause briefly before someone else rephrased the same point with slightly different wording. Suddenly, the room would respond more enthusiastically. "That's a great idea," someone would say. Other times, it happened in project updates. I would send a detailed summary outlining a solution or improvement, and a few days later, a manager would present the same concept to leadership during a review meeting. My original message would still be somewhere in the email thread, technically visible, but rarely referenced. None of these moments was big enough to confront. That's what made them so easy to normalize. If someone openly dismisses your work, the problem is clear. But when recognition simply drifts, it becomes harder to define and harder to challenge, because if you spoke up about it, the response would probably sound reasonable. "Oh, we didn't mean to overlook that." You know how meetings move fast? Everyone knows you contributed. Those explanations are just plausible enough to keep the peace. So instead of raising concerns, I adjusted my expectations. When I contributed something useful, I felt satisfied knowing it helped the team. When others received visible credit, I reminded myself that collaboration often looks messy from the inside. And when my manager praised the department for solving a problem, I took quiet pride in knowing I had played a role. For a long time, that felt like enough. But there was another shift happening beneath the surface, not in how others treated me, in how I interpreted it. At first, I thought the pattern meant I wasn't communicating clearly enough. Maybe my ideas needed stronger framing. Maybe I should speak up earlier in discussions. Maybe I simply needed more confidence in meetings. So I experimented. I prepared talking points in advance. I spoke a little sooner when discussions opened. I made sure my suggestions were structured clearly. Sometimes it helped. Other times, the same quiet transfer happened again. An idea leaving my mouth and arriving somewhere else. Still, I told myself the same thing each time. It's not intentional. It's just how groups work. People hear what they expect to hear. And in that office, people had already decided who I was. The steady one, the detail person, the one who kept things organized behind the scenes. Reliable, not influential. Once that identity settles into a workplace, it becomes surprisingly durable, because the longer it exists, the more comfortable everyone becomes with it, including you. And without realizing it, I had started playing the role that everyone else had written for me. Not loudly, not consciously, just quietly, going along with it. Until one day, I noticed something that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Not a single moment, but a realization about the role I had slowly been assigned. By the time I reached my 6th year at the company, something about my position had become settled, not in a formal sense. My title hadn't changed much, and on paper, my responsibilities still looked like those of a senior operations analyst. But socially, inside the invisible structure of the office, my role had become very clear. I was the stabilizer. Every organization has one. The person people quietly rely on when things start drifting off course. The one who understands the systems deeply enough to fix problems before they become visible. It sounds like a compliment, and in some ways it is. But there's a quiet trade-off that comes with that kind of reliability. When people depend on you to keep things running smoothly, they stop imagining you doing anything else. They don't picture you leading the meeting. They don't picture you directing the strategy. They picture you supporting it. I started noticing the pattern most clearly in project assignments. When a complicated initiative was launched, the same type of people were usually placed in charge. The confident presenters, the ones who spoke easily during executive updates, the ones whose ideas were already familiar to leadership. Meanwhile, I was often assigned to operational oversight, which meant documentation, coordination, tracking, making sure the pieces fit together. And to be fair, I was good at it. But over time, I began noticing something strange. Projects that I quietly organized behind the scenes were often celebrated as leadership successes for someone else. Their names appeared on presentations, their voices explained the outcomes. Their leadership was praised for bringing the team together. Meanwhile, my role stayed mostly invisible, tucked inside spreadsheets and process documents. Again, no one was trying to be cruel. The company simply had a story about who everyone was, and my chapter in that story had already been written. Reliable, helpful, steady, a support character in other people's success. At some point, I stopped expecting anything different, not because I lacked ambition, but because expectations shape behavior more than we like to admit. When everyone around you quietly agrees on who you are, pushing against that image starts to feel disruptive. And I had spent years being the opposite of disruptive. I arrived early, I kept things organized, I made sure people had the information they needed, the systems ran smoothly, the deadlines were met. From the outside, my career looked stable, respectable, even comfortable. But internally, something small had begun to bother me. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet question that returned occasionally when I walked home in the evening. If I disappeared tomorrow, would anyone notice the difference? Not emotionally, operationally. Would the system still function? Would the project still move forward? Or had I slowly become the kind of person whose work was only visible when it stopped happening? That question stayed with me longer than I expected. And then one day, something happened that made the answer a little clearer. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic moment, just a quiet realization during an ordinary afternoon, the kind that changes how you see everything afterward. The moment things shifted didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a performance review or a difficult conversation. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when most of the office had already started mentally preparing for the weekend. I remember the light coming through the windows that day. Seattle afternoons in early fall have a soft gray brightness to them, cloudy but still luminous. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a process map for a new logistics rollout. The project had technically been assigned to another manager, but as usual, I had been asked to help coordinate the operational side. Yeah, which meant I was the one tracing every step of the workflow to make sure nothing broke once the system went live. It was meticulous work, the kind that required patience more than creativity. Around 3 o'clock, Daniel walked past my desk and stopped briefly. "Hey, Faye," he said casually. "Quick question." I looked up. He gestured toward the conference rooms. "We're finalizing the rollout plan for the Phoenix expansion. Do you have that process documentation ready yet?" I nodded. "Almost finished. I'll send the full version by the end of the day." "Perfect," he said. "That'll help a lot." Then he added something that seemed like a compliment. "You're honestly the only one who really understands how all these pieces fit together." I smiled politely. "Thanks." Daniel nodded and continued down the hallway. The interaction lasted maybe 20 seconds, but something about his words stayed with me. Not because they were negative, because they were completely sincere. "You're the only one who really understands how all these pieces fit together." For years, I had thought of that kind of comment as validation, proof that my work mattered. But that afternoon, for some reason, I heard it differently. I looked back at the process map on my screen. 43 individual workflow steps. 7 departments are involved. 3 internal systems are interacting with each other. I had built the entire map myself. Every dependency, every exception case, every contingency path. If something went wrong during the rollout, I was the person most likely to notice why. Not because I had authority, because I had visibility. And suddenly I realized something that had never fully occurred to me before. The deeper my understanding of the company became, the less visible that understanding actually was. People knew I was helpful. They knew I could solve problems, but very few of them had any idea how much institutional knowledge had quietly accumulated in my notebooks, my folders, my archived documentation. Years of decisions, system changes, operational history, connections between departments that had formed and dissolved over time. I had been paying attention for a decade. Most people rotated roles every few years. Managers moved on to other companies. Projects started and ended. But I had stayed, watching, learning, recording. For the first time, I realized something important about that kind of knowledge. It doesn't just help you solve problems, it gives you perspective. Perspective on how fragile systems really are. How dependent organizations become on the people who quietly maintain them. I closed the process map and leaned back slightly in my chair. For years, I had been asking a quiet question. If I disappeared tomorrow, would anything actually change? That afternoon, I realized the answer was more complicated than I thought. Yes, things would change, but probably not in the way people expected. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me curious, because if understanding the system gave me that much visibility, then maybe silence wasn't just something that happened to me. Maybe it was something I could choose. After that Thursday afternoon, nothing about my behavior changed immediately. At least not in ways anyone else could see. I still arrived early most mornings. I still attended the same meetings. I still documented workflows, answered questions, and helped teams navigate complicated systems. From the outside, I was the same face Sterling everyone had known for years. But internally, something had shifted. Before that moment, my quietness had always felt passive, like something that simply happened because of my personality. I wasn't the loudest person in the room, so naturally I spoke less. I preferred listening, so naturally others filled the space. But now I started noticing something subtle about silence. When you stop seeing it as a limitation, it becomes a position. In meetings, for example, people often rush to fill empty space. Someone proposes an idea, and others immediately react, agreeing, disagreeing, expanding, debating. But the person who stays quiet for a little longer gets something valuable. Time. Time to watch how everyone else reveals their priorities. Time to see which concerns matter most to leadership. Time to understand which problems people are trying hardest to hide. Once I began paying attention that way, meetings started feeling very different. Not confrontational, almost observational. Like sitting near the edge of a stage while a play unfolds. People spoke freely around me because they had already decided who I was. The reliable analyst, the detail person, the one who kept records, not the person steering the conversation. That perception created a kind of invisible access. Managers would discuss strategic concerns without worrying that I might interpret them politically. Team leads would admit operational weaknesses, assuming I would simply help fix them. Engineers explained system limitations in technical detail because they knew I would understand. Over time, those conversations built a clearer picture of the organization than any single department could see. I began noticing how decisions actually traveled, not through formal org charts, through relationships. Someone trusted someone else. Someone owed someone a favor. Someone avoided a particular conflict. These patterns shaped outcomes far more than official policies ever did. And because I wasn't competing for attention, people rarely filtered what they said around me. It was a strange position to occupy, simultaneously central and invisible. Meanwhile, the habits I had built over the years continued quietly in the background. My notebook is filled with observations. My documentation folders grew deeper. Every system change, every workflow adjustment, every cross-team dependency, I kept careful records. At first, that habit had simply helped me do my job better. Now it served another purpose. Clarity, not about other people's intentions, about the structure of the company itself, how fragile some processes actually were, how dependent certain teams had become on undocumented knowledge, how often small decisions quietly shape much larger outcomes months later. None of this felt like power in the dramatic sense. It felt more like understanding the architecture of a building you had lived inside for years, knowing which beams supported the weight, which walls were cosmetic, which doors everyone assumed were permanent but weren't. And the more I observed, the more I realized something that most people inside the company never stopped to consider. Organizations are not as stable as they appear. They run smoothly because a handful of people quietly maintain the connections between systems. When those connections disappear, the structure doesn't collapse instantly. It just begins to drift. I didn't know yet what I would eventually do with that understanding. At that stage, I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was simply paying attention. But while everyone else continued moving through the office with familiar routines, something important was beginning to form quietly in the background. Preparation. Not because I expected conflict, but because understanding a system eventually gives you options. And the interesting thing about options is that most people never notice when someone starts creating them. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most of the time, it looks exactly like the work you were already doing. That's one of the reasons no one noticed anything different about my routine over the next year. I still carried the same worn black notebook between meetings. I still responded quickly to messages when someone needed help understanding a workflow. I still documented processes with the same careful detail. But gradually, the way I organized that information began to change. Before, my documentation had always been purely operational. Instructions, process diagrams, system notes, things that help teams complete their tasks efficiently. Now I began adding something else. Context. Not just what happened inside a system, but why did it happen? Who had made certain decisions? When those decisions had been implemented? Which departments relied on them now? At first, the habit developed almost unconsciously. I would finish documenting a workflow and then add a small note in my notebook. Trigger logic added during 2019. Phoenix rollout. Dependency between engineering queue and logistics confirmation. Or manual reconciliation step exists because the finance system cannot read warehouse timestamps directly. Tiny observations, but over time they began connecting together like threads in a larger map. I also started revisiting older documentation from my early years at the company. Some of it was buried deep inside archived folders that few people had opened in years. Inside those files were records of system changes, pilot programs, and experimental workflows that had quietly shaped the company's infrastructure. Most employees didn't need to know those details. They interacted only with the surface layer of operations. But when you trace the deeper structure long enough, something interesting happens. You begin to see which processes are essential and which ones only exist because someone once made a temporary decision that no one revisited later. I wasn't looking for leverage, not consciously. I was simply building a clearer picture of the environment I had spent a decade inside. At the same time, I began doing something else that also appeared perfectly ordinary. Learning. During my lunch breaks or quiet afternoons, I started exploring areas of the company's systems that weren't technically part of my job. Legal documentation related to vendor contracts, compliance procedures for international shipping regulations, data retention policies across departments. Nothing secret. Just information that most people never bothered to read because it wasn't immediately relevant to their daily work. For me, it was fascinating because each document revealed another layer of how the organization actually functioned. Over time, I noticed something subtle about these structures. The company looked highly coordinated from the outside, but internally, many processes depended on informal knowledge that had never been fully documented. Certain approvals only happened smoothly because someone knew the right person to contact. Some data transfers worked because a specific analyst manually checked them each morning. A surprising number of operational shortcuts existed simply because that's how we've always done it. None of this meant the company was poorly run. It meant it was human. Organizations grow faster than their systems can fully stabilize. People fill the gaps. And when those people stay long enough, they become part of the infrastructure. By my 9th year, I had unintentionally become one of those people. But here's the part no one around me noticed. As my understanding deepened, I also began thinking about my own future differently. Not emotionally, strategically. What would my career look like 5 years from now if nothing changed? Would I still be the reliable stabilizer? The quiet support behind other people's leadership? For the first time, I allowed myself to explore possibilities beyond the company. I updated my professional certifications, completed several advanced operations and compliance courses online, reconnected with former colleagues who had moved to other organizations. None of it felt like preparation for a dramatic exit. It simply felt responsible, like organizing your finances or maintaining an emergency savings account. You hope you never need it, but you're glad it exists if circumstances change. And yet, something interesting happened during that period. While I was quietly building knowledge and options in the background, the leadership team at my company was going through its own transitions. New managers arrived, old ones are left, departments reorganized. And during one of those shifts, I discovered something that changed everything. Not a rumor, not a suspicion. A piece of information so clear, so simple, that the entire situation suddenly looked different. It happened on a Tuesday morning, inside an internal system I had opened thousands of times before. But that day, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. And once I understood what it meant, the story of my career at that company began moving toward a completely different ending. The discovery didn't happen during a dramatic moment, no secret meeting, no whispered conversation in a hallway. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a workflow inside one of our internal systems. By my 9th year at the company, I had opened that system thousands of times. It tracked operational dependencies across departments, something I regularly checked whenever a new project launched. Most people only looked at the surface dashboard. I tended to dig a little deeper. That morning, I was verifying the approval sequence for a vendor contract connected to a logistics partner in Phoenix. The expansion project had introduced several new external vendors, and I wanted to make sure the documentation reflected the updated workflow. So I opened the Dependency History tab. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Approval timestamps, department signatures, automated routing steps. But as I scrolled further down the record, I noticed something small that didn't quite match the rest of the structure. A dependency flag. It was attached to a particular compliance verification step, one that connected vendor contracts with internal logistics authorization. Normally, those steps passed automatically through our system once the correct approvals were logged, but this one had an unusual note attached. Manual validation required. Operations override permitted. That line wasn't entirely unusual. What caught my attention was the name associated with the override authority. Mine. At first, I assumed it was a temporary configuration from years earlier, something created during a past rollout that simply hadn't been cleaned up yet. So I traced the history. The override permission had been added during the Phoenix expansion pilot 4 years earlier. Back then, the engineering team had needed someone who understood both the operational workflows and the vendor compliance process. The system required a human checkpoint to ensure that external logistics contracts aligned correctly with our internal shipping regulations. At the time, I had helped design the workflow map. What I hadn't realized was how that decision had been implemented. The engineers had assigned the manual validation authority to the operations role responsible for coordinating vendor logistics, which at the time was me. Most of the time, the step is processed automatically, but if anything about a vendor contract triggered the compliance flag, the system required manual confirmation before the workflow could continue, and only one person in the company had that permission. Me. I sat there quietly for a moment, reading through the documentation. It wasn't a dramatic authority. I couldn't approve contracts independently. I couldn't cancel vendor agreements. But the system design meant something very specific. If the validation step wasn't completed, certain vendor processes simply wouldn't move forward. Not immediately, not obviously. They would just pause, waiting for the manual confirmation step. And because the process had been running smoothly for years, most teams probably assumed the step was automated, which meant very few people had ever noticed who actually held that permission. I leaned back slightly in my chair. For years, I had been documenting the structure of the company's systems. Now I was seeing one small part of that structure from a completely different angle, not operationally, strategically. Again, this wasn't some secret power hidden in the system. Anyone with the right permissions could see the same configuration, but almost no one had reason to look, because the process rarely failed. And when systems work smoothly for long enough, people stop questioning how they function. What struck me most in that moment wasn't the authority itself, it was the clarity it created. For the first time, I saw something undeniable about my position in the company. Not the role people thought I played, the role the infrastructure actually relied on. A quiet intersection point between multiple departments, operations, compliance, vendor logistics. Not visible leadership, but structural importance. I didn't celebrate the discovery, I didn't feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt calm, because suddenly the question I had been asking myself for years had a clearer answer. If I disappeared tomorrow, things wouldn't collapse. But certain parts of the system would slowly start waiting for something that wasn't there. And once I understood that, the choices in front of me became much simpler. Not easy, but clear. Because sometimes the most important moment in a long story isn't when something changes. It's when you finally see the structure clearly enough to decide what you're going to do next. And once that clarity arrived, I knew a decision was coming. One that couldn't be reversed later. Once you see a system clearly, you start noticing how many choices quietly exist inside it. That realization didn't push me toward immediate action. In fact, for several weeks after discovering the validation permission in the system, I did exactly what I had always done. I kept working. The Phoenix expansion continued moving forward. New vendor contracts passed through the approval sequence. Teams prepared for the operational rollout, and meetings filled the calendar the same way they always had. From the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. But internally, I was thinking about something I had avoided for years. My future at the company. For most of my career there, I had assumed the path forward would gradually unfold. Work hard, build expertise. Eventually, recognition follows. That's the quiet promise many organizations make, even if they never say it out loud. But after 9 years, I had enough perspective to evaluate that assumption honestly. Recognition hadn't really arrived. Responsibility had. Visibility hadn't. And the role people expected me to occupy had become so stable that very few people imagined me doing anything else. Once I admitted that to myself, several options became visible. The first option was the simplest. Stay. Continue doing exactly what I had been doing for years. Maintain the systems, solve problems quietly, accept that my career inside the company would likely remain stable but largely invisible. There was nothing inherently wrong with that path. Many people build fulfilling careers that way. But when I pictured myself sitting at the same desk 5 years later, something inside me felt still. Not unhappy, just unmoving. The second option was more direct. Push for recognition. Request a leadership track. Ask for expanded authority. Make it clear that the work I had been doing behind the scenes deserved a different level of visibility. Again, that path was reasonable, but it required something I had rarely seen succeed in that particular culture. Challenging the narrative people had already written about you. Once an organization decides who you are, changing that story can be surprisingly difficult. Not impossible, but exhausting. Especially if you have to prove it over and over again. Then there was the third option, leave. Quietly, not in anger, not in protest. Just step away, take everything I had learned about operational systems, compliance frameworks, and cross-department coordination, and bring that experience somewhere new. At first, that option felt abstract. Leaving a company after nearly a decade isn't a small decision. The routines become familiar. The people become part of your daily life. Even the building itself starts to feel strangely personal. But the more I considered the possibility, the more something inside me settled. Because leaving didn't mean abandoning the work I cared about. It meant choosing where that work would matter. And once that thought arrived, another question followed naturally. If I were going to leave eventually, how should I do it? Many people exit companies quickly. 2 weeks' notice, a farewell email, a few handover documents. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. The systems I had helped maintain for 10 years weren't simple. They contained years of operational knowledge, informal dependencies, and undocumented habits that only a few people truly understood. Walking away suddenly would create chaos. And chaos wasn't something I wanted to leave behind. That's when the decision became clear. I would leave, but not abruptly, not emotionally. I would do it carefully, methodically, the same way I had always approached complex systems. Quiet preparation, clear documentation, and when the moment finally arrived, everything would already be in motion. What I didn't realize yet was how strangely the timing of that decision would align with something else happening inside the company, something that would make my departure much more significant than anyone expected. Once the decision was made, the process felt surprisingly calm. There was no dramatic moment when I announced it to anyone. No late-night burst of determination, no symbolic resignation letter sitting unfinished on my laptop, just a quiet shift in how I spent my time. For the first few weeks, my actions looked almost identical to what I had been doing for years. I attended meetings, I responded to emails. I continued refining the operational documentation for the Phoenix expansion. But beneath that familiar routine, something else had begun. Preparation. The first step was practical, understanding my own value outside the company. I had accumulated nearly a decade of experience managing complex operational systems, vendor compliance frameworks, and cross-department coordination. But for years, that expertise had existed mostly inside internal documents and meeting rooms, so I started translating it. During evenings and quiet weekends, I updated my professional portfolio. Not dramatically, just clearly. Instead of listing tasks, I described systems. Instead of describing responsibilities, I described outcomes. Operational bottlenecks resolved. Multi-department workflows stabilized. Compliance structures integrated into logistics processes. At the same time, I began having small conversations with people I trusted. Former colleagues who had moved to other companies, an operations director I had worked with briefly during a previous vendor project, a recruiter who specializes in organizational infrastructure roles. None of those conversations was urgent. They were exploratory. The interesting thing about professional networks is that they often remember your contributions more clearly than your own company does. People who had collaborated with me years earlier still associated my name with the operational clarity I had brought to certain projects. Several of them were now working at organizations much larger than ours. Organizations where operational architecture wasn't invisible support work. It was leadership. Those conversations slowly confirmed something I had suspected. The work I had been doing quietly for years actually carried significant value, just not necessarily inside the environment where I had originally developed it. Meanwhile, inside my company, the systems continued functioning exactly as before. That part mattered to me. If I were going to leave, I wanted the transition to be responsible, so I began doing something that most people only rush through during their final weeks: documentation. But instead of writing quick handover notes, I approached it the same way I approached any complex system: methodically. I reviewed older process maps and updated them with current dependencies. I clarified areas where informal knowledge had quietly replaced formal documentation. In several cases, I realized entire workflows relied on habits that only existed because certain people, including me, had maintained them over the years. So I recorded those details carefully, not because anyone had asked me to, because systems deserve continuity. At the same time, I quietly reduced my involvement in areas that had become unnecessarily dependent on me. When possible, I guided colleagues toward understanding processes themselves rather than simply asking me for answers. Most of them appreciated the clarity, a few even joked about it. "Faye's finally teaching the rest of us how the magic works," someone said during one meeting. I smiled when I heard that, because it wasn't magic. It was simply knowledge accumulated slowly over time, and knowledge becomes far more powerful when it's organized. Weeks passed this way. Quiet conversations outside the company, careful documentation inside it. No one around me suspected anything unusual. If anything, my manager seemed pleased that our operational processes were becoming more clearly structured, which is why the timing of what happened next felt almost surreal. Because just as I was preparing for a thoughtful, gradual transition, my calendar suddenly filled with a meeting invitation that suggested the company had something very different in mind. And the date of that meeting made the situation impossible to ignore. The calendar invitation arrived early in the morning. At first, I didn't think much about it. My inbox had already begun filling with the usual messages: status updates, project notes, and a few internal notifications. Calendar alerts were so common that most of them barely registered anymore, but this one caught my attention for a simple reason. The subject line was unusually formal: Organizational Alignment Discussion. The meeting included 3 people: my manager, Daniel, someone from HR, and me. That combination wasn't unheard of, but it was rare enough to feel deliberate. The scheduled time was 2 weeks away. I hovered my cursor over the invitation for a moment before opening it fully. There were no notes attached, just the meeting title and the participants. Normally, something like that might have triggered anxiety. Many people associate HR meetings with performance issues or restructuring announcements, but oddly, I felt calm, because the timing of the meeting was almost poetic. Earlier that same morning, before I had even seen the invitation, another email had arrived. This one is from the company's internal communications team. The subject line read, "Celebrating your 10-year anniversary." Inside was a cheerful message thanking me for a decade of dedication to the company. There was a small digital badge, a note about the anniversary recognition program, and a message saying leadership appreciated the stability employees like me brought to the organization. I stared at both notifications on my screen, the congratulations email and the meeting invitation, 2 completely different tones, arriving within the same hour. It was the kind of coincidence that makes you pause, because even without any explanation, the message between the lines felt clear. Something about my role in the company was about to change. I didn't panic. In fact, my reaction surprised even me. For years, the possibility of sudden organizational decisions had quietly worried me. Not because I thought I was underperforming, but because I understood how companies sometimes restructure positions that operate behind the scenes. But now, the situation felt different, because I had already made my decision. Leaving was no longer a question. It was simply a matter of timing. That realization removed something powerful from the equation: fear. Instead of worrying about what the meeting might bring, I simply continued my work. Over the next 2 weeks, nothing about the office atmosphere seemed unusual. People discussed projects the same way they always had. Deadlines moved forward. The Phoenix rollout entered its final coordination stage. Occasionally, someone congratulated me on my 10-year anniversary. "Wow, a decade," one coworker said during a coffee break. "You must know this place better than anyone." I smiled. "In some ways," I said. Meanwhile, the documentation I had been quietly preparing continued growing more complete. Process maps finished, dependency notes updated, operational handover guides are organized clearly. Everything was ready, which meant that by the time the scheduled meeting finally appeared on my calendar, I wasn't walking into it uncertain about my future. I was walking into it with a very clear understanding of what my next chapter would be. What I didn't yet know was how quickly the consequences of that clarity would begin unfolding for everyone else. Because sometimes the biggest changes inside organizations don't begin with confrontation. They begin with absence. And absence takes time before people fully notice it. The meeting itself was surprisingly short. When the time arrived, I walked into the small conference room near the HR offices with the same calm I had carried for weeks. Daniel was already there, seated near the end of the table. Next to him sat Laura from Human Resources, her laptop open in front of her. Both of them greeted me politely. Nothing about their tones suggested tension, but there was a certain carefulness in the air, the kind that usually appears when people have rehearsed what they're about to say. We exchanged a few brief pleasantries. Then Laura began. "Faye, thank you for meeting with us today," she said gently. "First, we want to acknowledge your 10 years with the company. That kind of long-term commitment is something we truly appreciate." I nodded. "Thank you." She paused briefly, glancing toward Daniel before continuing. "As the company continues evolving, we've been reviewing several operational roles across departments to make sure our structure aligns with future growth plans." The wording was familiar. Anyone who has worked inside large organizations long enough recognizes that tone immediately. It's the language companies use when they're about to restructure a position. Laura continued carefully. "Part of that review involves redefining certain responsibilities within the operations team. In your case, the company has decided to transition your role over the next several weeks." She spoke calmly, almost gently, but the meaning was clear. They were preparing to eliminate my position. Not abruptly. Not dramatically, but definitely. Daniel added something then, perhaps trying to soften the moment. "This isn't about performance, Faye. You've been incredibly reliable here. Honestly, one of the most dependable people on the team." He hesitated before continuing. "But the organization is moving toward a different operational structure." I listened quietly. There was no anger rising inside me. In fact, hearing the explanation felt strangely validating, because everything they were saying confirmed what I had already realized months earlier. The company's story about who I was had never really changed. Reliable, supportive, steady, but not essential. Not in the way leadership defines essential. When Laura finished explaining the transition plan, she asked gently, "Do you have any questions?" I paused for a moment before answering. "Just one." And both of them looked up. "How long is the transition period expected to last?" Laura glanced briefly at Daniel. "We're proposing about 6 weeks," she said. "During that time, we'd appreciate your help transferring operational knowledge to the rest of the team." 6 weeks. I nodded slowly. "That should be enough." Daniel seemed relieved by how calm the conversation was. "Thank you, Faye. We really appreciate your professionalism with this." I smiled slightly. Of course. Because the truth was, they were already too late. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing about the company was about to collapse. But the assumption behind their plan had a quiet flaw. They believed they were initiating the transition. In reality, the transition had started months earlier. The documentation was already complete. The external conversations about my next role were already underway. The systems they thought depended on me had already been carefully mapped and stabilized, or at least stabilized enough for me to step away. What they didn't yet realize was that understanding a system deeply enough to maintain it also means understanding exactly how its absence will slowly ripple outward. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but gradually, and once those ripples begin, they're surprisingly difficult to reverse, which meant that by the time the 6-week transition ended, The organization would finally begin noticing something it had overlooked for a very long time. Not confrontation, not protest, just the quiet space left behind when someone who understood the structure is no longer inside it. The first 2 weeks of the transition passed quietly, almost too quietly. I continued arriving at the office at the same time each morning. I answered emails, I documented processes, I organized files and created handover notes for each system I had managed over the years. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual, but beneath the surface, the rhythm of the team had begun to shift. It started with small things. A supplier invoice that normally moved smoothly through 3 approval stages sat untouched in the system for 2 days before someone noticed. A shipping schedule that used to update automatically every morning didn't refresh correctly one afternoon, forcing the logistics team to manually reconstruct the timeline. None of these issues was dramatic. Individually, they looked like ordinary operational hiccups, but they were happening more frequently, and people were starting to feel it. One afternoon during the 3rd week, Daniel stopped by my desk. He leaned lightly against the divider, holding a printed spreadsheet. "Quick question," he said casually. "Sure." He placed the paper down in front of me. "This vendor reconciliation file. I thought the system generated this automatically every Thursday?" "It does," I replied. He frowned slightly. "Well, it didn't this morning." I glanced at the spreadsheet. "The automation runs through a macro linked to the archive server," I explained. "It requires a manual trigger if the server updates overnight." Daniel looked mildly surprised. "I didn't know that." I nodded. "It's in the documentation I sent last week, page 14. He gave a short, awkward laugh. "Right. I'll take another look." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he asked the question he had clearly been holding back. "Faye, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." He lowered his voice slightly. "Were you handling more of these background processes than we realized?" I met his eyes calmly. "I handled the ones that needed to stay consistent." He studied my expression, trying to read between the lines, but there was nothing defensive there. Nothing confrontational, just a quiet statement of fact. He nodded slowly. "I see." Later that same week, Laura from HR appeared again. This time her visit was less formal. She walked over during the late afternoon when the office had started to empty. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. "Of course." She pulled up a chair beside my desk. "I've been reviewing the transition reports," she said carefully, "and a few department leads mentioned that certain processes seem more complicated than expected." I waited. She continued. "Daniel mentioned that you've been incredibly helpful in documenting everything, but it sounds like some of the systems require a deeper familiarity than we initially realized." Her tone wasn't accusatory. If anything, it sounded thoughtful, reflective, as if she were beginning to piece together something the company had overlooked. I answered simply, "Operational systems tend to evolve over time." Laura nodded. "Yes, that's what it looks like." She paused before asking one final question. "When your transition ends, do you already have something lined up?" The question wasn't official. It was personal curiosity. I allowed myself a small smile. "Yes," she returned the smile. I had a feeling. For a moment, she seemed like she wanted to say something more, but instead she simply stood. "Well," she said gently, "thank you again for handling this process the way you have." After she left, the office grew quiet again. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun was beginning to fade, and somewhere within the organization, something subtle had begun to shift. Not panic, not urgency, just awareness. The slow realization that some roles inside a system are not defined by their title, but by the quiet stability they create. And stability is something people rarely notice until it disappears. By the 4th week, something subtle had changed inside the company. Nothing had collapsed. No alarms had gone off. From the outside, everything still looked normal, but internally, things had begun to slow down. Small tasks that once moved effortlessly now require extra conversations. Reports needed manual corrections. Processes that had quietly synchronized for years started drifting slightly out of alignment. No one could point to a single cause. Yet more and more people began asking the same quiet question. Why does everything feel harder lately? Daniel noticed it first during a routine operations review. Several department leads mentioned minor issues, nothing serious on their own, but unusually consistent. Vendor confirmations were delayed. Routing updates needed repeated adjustments. Finance had started double-checking reports that had once balanced automatically. At one point, Daniel asked a simple question. How much of this used to run through Faye's workflow? The room fell silent because the truth was uncomfortable. For years, most of those systems had simply worked. No meetings required, no escalation needed, which meant no one had fully realized how many connections quietly passed through one person's oversight. Later that day, HR reviewed the transition documents I had prepared. Everything was clear. Every process is mapped. Every dependency explained. Technically, nothing had been left unfinished. But organizations sometimes misunderstand something important. Documentation can explain how a system works. It cannot replace the awareness of someone who has spent years watching how all the parts move together. By the time that realization began settling across the leadership team, the decision had already been made. And some decisions inside organizations don't create immediate consequences. They create slow ones, the kind that reveal themselves gradually. My final day arrived quietly. There was no farewell celebration, just a few kind messages and a brief HR meeting to complete the exit paperwork. After 10 years, leaving took less than half an hour. I packed the few things from my desk and looked around the office one last time. Everything seemed the same. Phones ringing, people working, conversations drifting between desks. The company would keep moving forward. Organizations always do. But I had learned something during those 10 years. When work runs smoothly for long enough, the effort behind that stability becomes invisible. And invisible work is easy to underestimate. As I walked out of the building that afternoon, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear, because this story was never about revenge. It was about something simpler, understanding your value before someone else decides it for you. Sometimes dignity doesn't require confrontation. Sometimes it only requires knowing when it's time to move forward. So I'll leave you with a question. Have you ever stayed somewhere too long because your quiet work wasn't being noticed? And how did you realize it was time to leave?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.